This is Photographing the West podcast, the podcast for people who love to explore the western highways and byways while photographing the landscape and wildlife. And now here's your host, Kirby Flanagan.
Hello, and welcome to episode number 62 of the Photographing the West podcast. I'm your host, Kirby Flanagan. This episode is brought to you by Photo Tees. Before we get into the program, I'd like to give a special shout out and thank you to Canadian listener Sue Fun for a very nice 5-star review in iTunes. It's very much appreciated. Today it's a pleasure to have with me again photo editing software guru Matt Kloskowski. Thanks for being here again, Matt.
Hey, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So Matt, talk about the texture slider in Lightroom and how it applies to nature and wildlife photos in addition to just smoothing skin.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting because it started out as a skin smoothing slider, and I believe it actually was called by Adobe. It was called smoothing at first, and then they started seeing what would happen if you kind of brought it the other way, right? Because almost every slider inside of Lightroom starts in the middle at 0 and goes to plus 100 or minus 100. So they started to see what happens if you took it the other way, and I think that's how they came up with the fact that it works good for smoothing skin, which they wanted to include inside of Lightroom because Lightroom didn't really have, you would have to go into Photoshop if you wanted to do that, and you have a lot of photographers that want to stay in Lightroom. But I think they realized it works great for adding a degree of sharpening or texture to certain things in the photo. So it's been incredibly well received. I had no idea, I did a little video on it and I had no idea how many times it would get viewed. I did a comparison to what was clarity and some sharpening and whatnot. And it just looks like it's been a very, very well received new slider inside of Lightroom.
So is it useful for nature and wildlife photos or not so much?
No, absolutely. I think it works great. I think, sharpening has its place, and that sharpening is really detecting edges, and it will add contrast to edges, where texture is going to take fine details and add texture. There's really no other way to say it. Which are typically very prominent inside of nature and wildlife photos. You've got a lot of texture. You've got trees, you've got mountains, you've got fur, whatever it happens to be, sands, rocks, all those different things. And all those things respond very, very well to adding texture, not necessarily just sharpening.
Okay. But there's no way to add other textures like Alien Skin or some of those other software programs, I guess, huh?
No, it's not an artful texture, almost a fine art type of a texture thing where you'd bring in various textures. It's more of a smoothing, or the opposite of smoothing, which would be just to add a degree of, almost a grit to the photo, but not necessarily a texture overlay.
So Adobe talks about medium frequency parts of an image, and what does that mean, and how do you find them?
Yeah, so frequency and tone are different, because when you think about, like, we have clarity, which is a mid-tone slider. Your mid-tones are those middle gray areas. Well, mid-frequency doesn't have to necessarily be a mid-tone. A middle frequency could be in a bright or dark area of the photo, because think of frequency. A very low frequency area would be sky. All right, sky, smooth water, even skin. Even certain skin textures would be a low frequency because there's not a lot of little tiny details happening. A high frequency area would be sand. It would be, the foliage and trees. Those would be very high frequency. So now you have your middle frequencies, which again could be rocks. It could still be trees. It could be bark on a tree. All those different things that aren't necessarily as gritty as sand, but aren't as smooth as, say, a sky. that's going to be a medium frequency part of the photo. And again, frequency and tone don't necessarily have to be the same thing, which is why you've still got your clarity slider for adding contrast to middle toned areas where frequency is just going to be different.
Okay, so you just kind of have to play with the slider and see what it does.
I mean, yeah, I can point people to my website where I did a video where I compare texture versus clarity. And you can see all the comparisons in the world that you want, but at the end of the day, none of that matters unless you're practicing. I always say people should be practicing more than they're watching videos and reading books on this stuff. So the best thing that you can do is open up a few photos and pixel peep a little bit and zoom in on some areas and practice and see what it does and see what responds better for you. Which part do you like better? Sure,
that's excellent advice. So moving on, so to speak, ON1 says it's legitimate all-in-one competitor to Lightroom and Photoshop. Do you agree or disagree, and why?
I would say I partially agree. So ON1 is a pretty darn close competitor to Lightroom, and the features it doesn't have are typically not the most used features inside of Lightroom, like a map or books or a good print module, which print's pretty well used, but it's not going to have a slideshow or anything like that. But they've gotten pretty darn close. It's a close competitor to Lightroom. It's a mild competitor to Photoshop. It will not replace Photoshop, and they'll keep adding things that do Photoshop like things. But the problem with trying to compete with Photoshop is the Swiss Army knife, and it's just impossible. It's impossible to make anything that you can do because Photoshop can do anything. So you can pick apart little things here and there, but unless you're going to build Photoshop, you're never going to get to a Photoshop competitor. So for some people, I would say it can be a replacement. For other people that, somebody like me, I do a lot of work in Photoshop, with complex masking, layering. It does have layers, but that merging of masking in there and some of the filters that we have inside of Photoshop, it's not going to be a Photoshop replacement for me. So like I said, I guess what I said in the beginning, I kind of agree. I think it's a pretty close competitor to Lightroom, but not going to be there for Photoshop.
They claim they make masking easier. Do you agree with that?
I think out of the alternatives that are there right now, between, let's call the big three, ON1, Luminar, and Capture One, I think out of the alternatives that are there right now, ON1 has the best masking. I would always use the best tools available, and Photoshop still is the best when it comes to masking. So if you're going to find an alternative, yes, ON1 is going to have the best complex masking out there from the alternatives, but I still think Photoshop's better.
Photoshop's able to do more complex masking, is that it?
It's not necessarily just the ability to do the complex masking. It's the quality of the mask that gets built from the tools that you have, so that you don't have all the halos and all those little problems that we get stuck with when you're building more of a complex mask.
Okay. So what are the differences between ON1 and Lightroom? Has been the organization of photos, and now they claim to have a better way of organizing photos. Talk about the differences between ON1 and Lightroom and their organization of photos and their pluses and minuses.
Well, so they handle it a little bit differently. Lightroom has a catalog, and that's your price of admission. You can't just open Lightroom fresh and browse to a folder on your computer. You have to import your photos. As part of that import process, you do get a lot of benefits. You get a faster viewing, you get faster searching, you get the ability to search and filter throughout all of your folders. There's a reason why they do a catalog and don't just do a photo browser, which is like your Finder window on a Mac or the Windows Explorer window on a PC, where you just open it up and it's got a folder view and you just navigate to folders computer. On1 chose to go in a little bit of a different direction in that they created a browse module, and browse is simply just that. It is browsing the hard drive on your computer. So the first thing, somebody that moves from Lightroom to On1 says is, well, where do I import my photos? You don't have to import your photos. You go to the browser and you just browse to the folder wherever you put them, right? Could be on an external hard drive, could be on an internal hard drive, could be on a card reader. You just browse to that location, just as if you opened up your file browser on your computer. So they chose to go that route. One of the downsides of going that route is going to be when it comes to searching through your photos and filtering through your photos. If you're using keywords, if you're doing picks and rejects or labels or star ratings or anything like that, because that's where the catalog comes in. If you wanted to go look through your photos for all photos taken, let's say with a 24 to 70 millimeter lens, or all photos taken at ISO 1600, you've got to have a catalog that's got that information in it, and a browse system doesn't have that. So what they did is they created what they call a cataloged folder area, where it's kind of a hybrid, right? You've still got your browser, but if you've got a photos folder that's got all of your photos in it, maybe in 100 subfolders inside of that, you can catalog that folder, and then you'll be able to search through it and find different things. If you don't catalog it, all you'll be able to filter is the folder you're looking at. But if you do catalog it, then you can search through. Now you're basically back to a catalog. You can't go moving your photos around. You can't do all those things, because then you start to break the catalog and the references that it's built. So it's kind of an organizational browser of sorts if you want to use it that way, but it can also be a catalog if you want to use it that way, which is why I refer to it more of a hybrid.
Okay. Any difference in performance between the two programs?
They're both pretty fast. They're on one. On the browsing on one is pretty quick. It'll draw your thumbnails when you first, if you double click on a folder that's got 500 photos in it, it'll start to draw those thumbnails pretty quick. In Lightroom, the key is with Lightroom, a lot of people don't know, because there's multiple options. When you do your import with Lightroom, if you choose the embedded and sidecar preview option, then Lightroom is lightning fast. A lot of people just don't know to do that, or they're using an older version of Lightroom, like Lightroom 6, because Lightroom's performance has improved greatly since the perpetual version, the last version, which was Lightroom 6. The performance has improved. So either somebody's using an older version of Lightroom, and On1's going to be way faster. If you're using a current version of Lightroom, it's just knowing to choose that embedded and sidecar option. And then the other thing is, and this will hold true for On1 as well, when you're looking through your photos, you need to be in that browse or library module. Because what happens is if you go into a develop module and you start using a film strip to look through your photos, what's happening is every single time you go to the next photo, that develop module needs to build a full-size preview of that photo, because now you're working in develop. Now you need all this information. And so if you're in Lightroom and you're trying to scroll through your photos very quickly and develop, it's not going to happen, because it's just, again, it's got to build that preview every time. If you stay in library, it literally, like I did some bird photography the other week, and I shot like 1,000 photos with the Sony A9. So it's 20 frames a second. Well, I went into library and I mashed down on that right arrow key. It literally looked like a video. It goes through it so fast. It's just, you need to know the nuances of the settings that you need to do and the places that you need to be to look through that. But On1 would be the same. Again, you need to be in its browse module to go through fast, not in the develop module.
Well, it's good to know. I guess I wasn't aware of that change in previews either, so I'll have to go back and check on that, I guess.
Yeah, it happened about probably year and a half or so ago. So it's but a lot of people missed it. It's, to Adobe's detriment. To Adobe's detriment, they have so many programs, and they're there's so many updates to so many programs that they don't do a great job of letting people know when really good stuff comes out. And again, to their detriment, Adobe doesn't do much education. So they leave, Adobe creates software, they leave the education and all that other stuff up to everybody else. So if you just went to Adobe's website, it would be like a bullet point on a list of many bullet points, where, if you go to ON1 or any other company, they release their software, but they also do their own education, and they'll tend to make things like that a little bit more known, a little bit more available, where Adobe just buries it in a list of new features. People probably don't know that, noise reduction has been improved probably 3 or 4 times in the last few years. It just gets buried in a bullet point, and people miss it. So probably bad for Adobe, good for other companies.
Yeah, and good for you, I guess, to be able to provide that information to folks.
It's I guess it's why I still have a job, right?
Right. So ON1 claims to be easier to use and provide more artistry than Adobe. Is that true or not? And what's the learning curve like for ON1?
So more artistry than Adobe. I would disagree with that. Is it more artistry than Lightroom? Yeah, because Lightroom is the raw editor. Lightroom is your raw editor. You can do all of your raw controls. You can still get artistic in how you're going to, brush or do selective adjustments and whatnot. What you can't do inside of Lightroom would be add layers. You can't add layers and, throw in a different background or a texture on top, or, blend multiple layers together. You can't do that in Lightroom. So yeah, ON1 offers layers. They offer things like textures and borders and things that you would have to jump to Photoshop for. So is it more artistic than Lightroom? Yeah. Is it more artistic than Lightroom and Photoshop combined? No. I mean, not in a million years, because Photoshop, just as we talked about before, offers so many different things. There's just so many filters. There's so much around it. There's so much community around Photoshop. There's so much third-party developers, what are people that are making plugins and add-ons. They're going to make it for the programs that are getting used the most. So I think Photoshop would take it there. As for the learning curve for ON1, I think that would be a benefit of a program like that, in that you've got your browser, you've got your develop settings, which I always call the technical settings, like your basic toning and your sharpening and noise reduction and lens corrections. You've got all that, but also at the same time, in the same interface, you've got filters. You've got filters if you wanted to have an antique look. You've got filters if you wanted a high key look. You've got the ability to add layers and add multiple photos on top of each other and blend those photos with blend modes and all of that other fun stuff inside of there. So I'd say the learning curve is fairly light if you're familiar with that world. As long as you're not learning fresh what exposure does and what shadows and highlights do, I'd say you could move over to a program like ON1, or even, there's other programs out there. Luminar is another one that does it, but say you can move over those programs pretty easily. There's going to be a learning curve to the differences in the interface, but the terminology and the tools would all be pretty similar.
Okay, good to know. Just to give ON1 a little plug, they have a special going on right now until May 31st, which gives you a pretty nice price for this new software if you already have ON1. So you might want to check that out.
Yeah, so I think if I can add on to it, I would say, they've got good prices on the software. I'd say something else to consider if you're going to make a move away from Adobe, which a lot of people, especially given some recent Adobe news, people seem to be talking about these days. I think if you're going to make a move from Adobe to a program like On1, one of their strengths. In fact, I'll be wrapping it up today. I'm making a free course called "Are You Ready to Switch from Adobe?" And what I'm doing is I'm going through and giving the pros and cons of some of the big competitors that are out there. So On1, Luminar, Capture One, some stuff from DxO, Affinity Photo. And one of the things that On1 got in the pro column versus many of the other competitors is they have On1 Plus, which is their community. So what's going to happen is if you switch from Adobe, you're going to lose community and education in just about every company you go with, because Adobe is the biggest, and educators and people that are doing this stuff are going to, of course, make their products for the biggest companies because that's where they get the bang for the buck. So you're going to lose that community if you just go onto Google and start searching for tutorials. But On1's got a really nice community on their website. You do pay yearly for it, but you get free courses every month. You get free presets. You get free video. Lots of good stuff added on. So I would say wherever you go, look for community, because you don't want to be in this alone. You don't want to be on a program where now you're looking for a tutorial on something and you can't find it because you chose a program that's not widely supported by the community that's out there. And On1 does a good job on their website of doing that. It'll cost you a little bit extra money, but I think it's worth it in the long run.
Well, good to know. That's a thought that hadn't occurred to me, and I think it's not widely spoken about. So,
yeah,
good. Well, Matt's off to Costa Rica for his workshop there very shortly, so we're going to kind of wrap things up pretty quickly. Matt, you want to talk about your workshop for a few seconds before you go?
Yeah, I mean, it's I'm leaving soon for it, but it's a wildlife photography workshop in Costa Rica in the Osa Peninsula. It's just a super great place. It's just so much wildlife. It's at a place that's literally built into the rainforest. So it's not like this preserve where animals are set up for you. You are in the rainforest, but it's a lot of fun to get around this wildlife that just really surrounds you, and some of the photo opportunities that you can get there. So best thing I can say is if you're interested in something like this, I usually just open up registration for it every January. So you can visit mattk.com. There's a little contact link in the top left corner. And of course, shoot me an email if you want to get put onto a wait list for the next one, as this one is sold out. I've got one actually coming up in Tuscany as well. So if you're interested in that, again, just visit the website and shoot me a link. That one is sold out minus one spot. So there is one spot open if you're interested in. That one's in September, and I can get you more info on it.
Okay. So is the one you're talking about in Costa Rica, is that on the East Coast or the West Coast, or?
That is in the southwest coast of Costa Rica.
Okay. And what sort of wildlife can people expect to see there?
We'll see all four types of monkeys that they have. So lots of monkeys, lots of birds, toucans. We see sloths, although sloths are typically deep into the trees. They're great when you can get close to one and photograph, because they don't move a lot like the monkeys do, but they're usually deeper into the trees, a little bit harder to find. Owls, again, numerous birds, little frogs and some little creepy crawly things. Lots of macro opportunities. We even do this. Costa Rica is one of the surfing capitals of the world, so we even get out there and one afternoon, photograph some surfers while we're eating lunch. So it's a lot of diversity.
Yeah, sounds like fun.
Yeah, it's great.
Well, thanks for listening, everyone. Look for show notes at www.flanaganphotos, spelled FOTOS.com. If you enjoy these podcasts, please leave us a review on iTunes like Sue Fun did. We'll talk soon. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to Photographing the West podcast. Please subscribe to the podcast in iTunes and leave us a review. Till next time, here's wishing you safe travels and good light.